You said there's 500 seats for this, is that right?
500, yeah. And then broadcast. Okay, let's see. All right, greetings to everybody who's already online. I'm Kate, the Communications and Outreach Coordinator for the Natural Areas Association. We are really happy that you guys could be here. Thank you so much for rearranging your schedule, because I know that many of you had to do that when we postponed this. So we're really glad that you kept up with us and managed to be on today. While we're getting ready and putting up slides and everything, I do have a question that hopefully you guys can use to get used to using the chat function. So the chat function is what we use to have you guys ask questions of Rich and Vicki. And what I'd like to ask you today is, what is your main reason for being here today? Is there a particular project that your organization is working on? Was there a particular situation that you found yourself in and you didn't have the information for it? Or is this just something general? You know this is a hot topic, it's very interesting, lots of people are wanting more and more information about this topic. Let us know in the chat box, and also if you could give us an idea of where you're from so that we can see what regions have what concerns. Let me make sure that I am. Also, just a little bit, you want to set it so that your chat goes to all panelists and attendees, unless you just want to ask a question of the panelists, in which case you can confine it. But all panelists and attendees is pretty much. Hi, everybody. I'm getting people from Savannah, Seattle, Montgomery, State College, Minnesota. Oh, gosh, so many here. I can't even read them fast enough. Some people say their interests are general. Other people say they've got currently restoring a 125-acre campus. All right, 8th grade school in Delaware. How to talk to people about using pesticides. Forest Service in West Virginia. Hi, Cheryl. Biologist with USGS in Boise. Post-fire ecology and wild pollinators. I'm hoping Rich and Vicki can see some of these too. There's some really interesting stuff. We'll capture all of this. This is really interesting stuff. So thank you for sharing this with us, you guys. We appreciate it. Awesome. Ellen Jones from Fort Larned National Park Service looking for good topics for middle school students. We've got everybody from all over. This is wonderful. Okay. Great, thank you so much, you guys. Please feel free to continue to share that stuff, but I'm gonna sort of get us rolling. We have a long presentation today. It probably will go over an hour, just so you know. Let's see what we've got here. Oh, Ellen, you just raised your hand. We're not using that as questions. We'd ask you to put it in the chat because, well, it's hard to explain, but it's it's not going to work. Let me put it that way. There's going to be a lot of you and there's going to be a lot of questions. So, okay. Just want to get ready on our slide. Uh-oh.
That was just me.
Okay. Vicki's on. Yay. We had a little bit of a technical problem, but I think we were past it. Yay. Okay. Welcome to the Role of Honeybees in Natural Areas of Conversation, and we have two separate talks today. We are super lucky to have Rich Hatfield of the Xerces Society with us and Vicki Wojcik of the Pollinator Partnership. We really owe them a lot. This is a reprise of some talks that they have given already. I'll tell you more about that in just a second. And if you guys will bear with me for a few moments, we're going to just give you some very basic information about NAA. And a few things that are coming up for us, and then we're going to just right on to Vicki and Rich. So, yeah, here we go. You just never know if those slides are going to work. There we go. All right, this is us. We're the Natural Areas Association. I think many of you already know who we are, but if you do not, there's a lot more information available on our website at naturalareas.org. We recommend that people go on there to get more detail. We are the only national nonprofit membership organization that's dedicated to the support and advancement of the community of natural areas professionals. In other words, all of you. We have some of our mission priorities there listed. Feel free to check them out and check us out more online. If you're not a member, obviously we encourage you to join us, and we'll tell you a little bit more about why that might be worth your time in just a second. So thank you and welcome. We also wanted to remind you that 2019 Natural Areas Conference is happening October 8th through 10th in Pittsburgh, PA. Woohoo! And we have a proposal deadline for April 15th. I've listed pretty much all of our topics there that we're looking for proposals on, and we're looking for proposals for a lot of different things: individual oral presentations, symposia, field workshops, ID workshops. There's a whole list of things on our website. Again, naturalareas.org is where you want to go to find more information about that and to put in a proposal for the conference. A little shout out here, Vicki and Rich are both reprising talks they gave at last year's Natural Areas Conference for this webinar. So this is the kind of material you can expect at our conferences. In other words, good stuff that you want to hear. That's it for that. And we also wanted to let you know about a tool that's available to our members that we're pretty excited about. Our conversation is going to continue on this topic. We found that this is a topic of incredible interest for a lot of land management professionals. And we have message boards that are part of our outreach and education effort. They're kind of a new thing for us. We're really trying to kick them into gear. They're only accessible, however, to NAA members. So members can sign up for message boards by logging in. And this is what you would see, and you would click that communication icon and go to message boards underneath it. If you have any trouble and you're a member, you can always email us at info@naturalareas.org. You can email me or Amy in membership, or you can just call us. We'll get back to you right away if we don't pick up. The Pollinators message board is moderated by Vicki Wojcik herself. Yay! We're very, very happy to have that. So we really have an expert helping us kick this off and get it going. So we are really hoping that you will join. If you are not already a member, log in, sign up, take advantage of it as a tool to keep us connected. This is a pretty crucial topic. Discussion is going to be ongoing, and these boards are part of our continuing initiative to help you professionals collaborate, share information with each other. If you're not a member, obviously email us at info@naturalareas.org or give us a call. Before we turn to the presentations, I want to remind you all that this webinar should be available on the NAA's YouTube channel, and it will be posted on our website. If it's processed in time, I will also add the link to your follow-up Zoom email, which you will receive in about 24 hours. So don't worry, you'll have it. And it will also be posted online. If you're looking for the NAA YouTube channel, just Natural Areas Association YouTube, and you should be able to find it just fine. Okay, I'm going to get out of that. And I think Rich is probably going to start his screen in just a minute, but I wanted to remind everybody to use the chat function to ask questions. I'm going to be monitoring. We probably will not be able to answer everybody's questions, so I apologize for that up front, but we are going to do our best to get to everyone's that we can. All right, and with that, welcome, Rich Hatfield.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me and see my screen okay?
Let's see.
Yes. Can you see my screen and hear me?
You're getting lots of yeses.
Okay, great. I was just looking for some verbal confirmation there because my screen no longer shows the chat function or anything. So great, thanks for that introduction. Thanks for everybody for being here on a Wednesday morning or afternoon, depending on which time zone you're in. Excited to talk about this topic and hopefully address some of your concerns. I see a lot of great things in the chat there, and looks like we're represented all across the country with a lot of good questions. So hopefully we can get to this. I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon, with offices all over the country. I think we have offices in over 10 states right now. We have over 50 employees. A lot of our employees work directly on farms with farmers, trying to increase pollinator habitat throughout North America. I work for the Endangered Species Program. where I'm working on invertebrates that are imperiled. Most of my work is with bumblebees, but I also work with jumping slugs and a lot of other animals as well. We are a nonprofit, and we're also a member-based organization. So member support helps us do presentations like this and put all of the great materials that are available on our website for people. So we would love to have you all as members, and the information you need is there on the screen. You can see us at xerces.org. So today I'm here to talk to you about how honeybees interact with natural areas and native bees. I'm going to give you a brief overview of pollinators and introduction to native bees, and then talk about some of the issues in natural areas as we talk about potentially pasturing honeybees in some of these natural areas. What are the issues that could come up? And then after I'm done with that, I'm going to share with you some recommendations for natural areas land managers that we've come up with. And then when I'm done, Vicki is going to dive a little bit deeper into the competition issue and actually look at some of the studies that have shown or that have measured direct impact to native bees. And then at the very end, we will address any questions that you might have. So quickly diving in here with an overview of pollinator ecology and honeybees and native bees in 5 minutes, which could be an hour talk of its own. Here we go. So most of you probably know this is a very important topic, but we're here because pollinators are important. 85% of the flowering plants on the planet require an animal, and usually that animal is an insect, and usually that insect is a bee for pollination. So the majority of our plant diversity is dependent on pollinators, and the same is true for the food that we eat. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we put into our body comes from a plant that was pollinated by a bee. There are 6 main groups of pollinators, of insect pollinators. We have our, sorry, I'm trying to get my pointer here. There we go. We have butterflies, flies, moths, wasps, beetles, and bees. And of these, when we talk and really think about pollinators, bees are really the preeminent pollinators in most landscapes. And that's because they're really the only animals that are intentionally moving pollen through the landscape. They eat pollen, it's their only source of protein, and it's also what they feed to their young. So they create balls of pollen and actually lay their eggs directly on those balls of pollen. And so their young are eating that as their primary source of protein as they are developing. And because of that, bees are constantly moving pollen through the landscape, obviously not for the purpose of pollination, but the consequence of that is pollination and pollination services. So that is what make bees such great pollinators. All those other insects that we talked about on the last slide, they're visiting flowers usually for nectar or sugar, and they might happen to pick up some pollen on their bodies while they're doing that, but they're not the really highly efficient pollinators that bees are, because they're intentionally moving pollen through the landscape. When most people think about bees, they think about honeybees, and this is becoming less and less true as organizations and people start raising awareness of native bees. But the fact of the matter is, the general public, when they think about bees, or they only think about this animal. And European honeybees are super important crop pollinators, but they are non-native. They were introduced to the United States in the 1600s, likely for candle wax and potentially for sugar and mead. So they're not native here, and they are generally, for the most part, managed by people. So they travel around in boxes, and that brings up just very different conservation and very different management issues than a lot of our native bees. They also live in these huge social colonies of up to 50,000 individuals in a single hive. And most of our native bees, are a single hole living in the ground by themselves somewhere. So while honeybees are very important crop pollinators, when we get into our natural areas and our native areas, honeybees really aren't doing much pollination in those areas. Research shows that honeybees visit less than 50% of the native plants in a lot of natural areas. So these areas are dependent on our native bees out there, all different sizes and shapes of native bees doing the pollination services outside of our farms in our natural areas. In North America, north of Mexico, we have 3,600 species of native bees, or more than 3,600 native species. And these are our insurance policy against potential continued losses of the European honeybee. So maintaining these populations and this diversity is really important for long-term ecosystem health and plant diversity. In addition, it's these native bees that are pollinating the native plants that feed a lot of our wildlife. Everything from songbirds to grizzly bears, the majority of their diet are fruits, nuts, seeds, berries, and roots. And the majority of those plants are pollinated by bees. And in most cases, those are native bees. So our native bees aren't just continuing wildflowers, they're also directly and indirectly feeding our wildlife. We are seeing really, at this time in our lives, a dramatic decline in pollinators. Most of the decline that people know about and think about is with the European honeybee, and they are in trouble. But in most cases, the declines that we've seen in European honeybees it truly is an agricultural issue and not a conservation issue. The European honeybee is not in danger of going extinct. It's a managed species in many cases, kind of like a cow or a chicken. And of course, there are really important conservation issues that need to be dealt with, but they're different than what is going on with our native bees. And the declines we're seeing in our native bees are, parallel, if not more severe than what we're seeing with our honeybees. And in some cases, we are talking about extinction with some of our native bees. We have a bumblebee in the western United States, in southern Oregon, northern California, that hasn't been seen since 2006, Franklin's bumblebee. It very well may be extinct. So we are talking about some major conservation issues with our native pollinators. And if you start to look at some of these large-scale studies that have taken place over the last several years, we're seeing really significant declines of 40%, 30%, 1/3. So huge numbers of our native bees and pollinators are facing, some degree of extinction risk. And more recently, there's been a lot of interest in just sort of general insect declines. A lot of studies looking at biomass and huge groups of animals, and this is a paper that just came out a couple of weeks ago that's talking about an entomofauna decline. So pretty much across many major groups of insects, we're seeing large, significant declines, and in most cases, the declines are driven by habitat change. So decrease in habitat is affecting these pollinators and other invertebrates, and so we need to move towards a restoration of a highly functional, high quality habitat and need to find a way to do that. As I've mentioned, we've also seen, declines in honeybees, and these are major and increasing. So there are some really significant issues with honeybees, and we need to find solutions not just to honeybee declines, but also to our native bee declines. One of the things that is clear is we don't know that much about a lot of our native bees, since they are, a single animal living in a hole in the ground by itself. It's very hard to track their populations, their population growth. Even knowing where they live or what their names are can be very, very challenging with the diversity of species and the diversity of habitats that we do have. One of the groups of animals that we do know the most about is our bumblebees. I'm the Red List Authority for the Bumblebee Specialist Group for the IUCN. We finished an analysis of North American bumblebees that suggests that about 1 out of 4 of them are facing some degree of extinction risk. And these are sort of some of the major species that we've seen now. This is the species I mentioned, Franklin's bumblebee. that has not been detected since 2006. The rusty patch bumblebee was added to the Endangered Species Act as an endangered species in 2016. And then the western and yellow-banded bumblebees are under review by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for endangered species protection. And in Hawaii, actually, we have 7 species of native bees in the genus Hylaeus, yellow-faced bees, that are also on the Endangered Species Act. So that's a kind of a brief overview of native bees and those systems and the declines that we're seeing. And so now diving a little bit deeper into the issue that we came here to talk about today, which is what are the potential impacts of honeybees in natural areas, looking at native bee populations, plant communities, and in a brief foray into some other wildlife as well. We're going to start by looking at competition. And basically the question here is, are honeybees competing with native bees for resources? There are a number of different ways that honeybees could exhibit competition on native bees. The number one is resource depletion. So just the pure abundance of honeybees actually takes away the amount of pollen nectar in the ecosystem. Competition can also lead to a resource shift. So honeybees, through their abundance or through resource depletion, can actually force native bees to less rewarding and less abundant resources on the landscape, which can change the reproductive success. We can also look at competitive exclusion, where honeybee abundance basically completely forces native bees from the area. They're so abundant that native bees foraging efficiency just decreases to the point where they choose to go somewhere else. And then all of the above factors can lead to basically deviation from optimal foraging theory, which leads to more energy per foraging bout, which then obviously decreases fecundity or population growth and reproduction. So all of these things are issues or potential issues when you increase or introduce honeybees to any system. And if we look at starting with resource depletion, there's been a number of studies that have come out in the last 15 years or so looking at this. Dave Goulson showed that a single hive of honeybees in a year can collect somewhere between 20 and 130 pounds of pollen. And that same honeybee hive can collect between 120 and 900 pounds of nectar in a single year. And it's important to realize that not all systems may be pollen or nectar limited, that in some cases that may be just scratching the surface, but there may be other ecosystems or in shoulder times of year where taking that much pollen out of the landscape really might have a significant effect on resource availability. Similarly, in 2017, Jim Kane and Vince Tepedino put a paper together that looked at resource depletion of honeybees, and they found that a 40 hive apiary over the course of 3 months removes the pollen equivalent of 4 million wild bees. So what that means is that the honeybees in that 40 hive apiary out in the landscape, the pollen that they're taking away would have otherwise fed the pollen equivalent of 4 million, wild native bees. It's hard to imagine that that's not a significant amount of resources in almost any in any landscape. Again, this study did not look at whether systems are pollen limited. Many systems may not be pollen limited, but certainly that is a lot of resources to be taken out of the landscape. And if we get to an area in sort of early spring or late fall, which are key times of year for a lot of species, that's a lot of resources to be pulling out of the landscape for a standard 40 hive apiary. There's another study that came out last year, Henry and Rodet, that looked at the effects of honeybees on wild bees in protected areas. And what they found is that high honeybee densities had a significant effect on native bee abundance. They decreased native bee abundance. They also decreased native bee foraging success. And interestingly enough, when the density of honeybees were high enough, they also decreased honeybee foraging success. So when honeybees were at really high abundances, they were actually affecting their own foraging success because densities were so high. So the takeaways from this study were that high honeybee densities are not good for native bees, and frankly, they're not good for honeybees either. And notably, this study was done during a period of high resource mass, what they called a mass flowering event, and at an area in Europe where honeybees are native, which is obviously not the case in many of our natural areas here in the United States and Canada, where honeybees are not native, and very few of our natural areas, at least for significant periods of time, exhibit something called a mass flowering event. In addition, honeybees have been shown, this is a recent study that came out in 2018 as well by Portman, that looked at honeybees interacting with native bees in a desert ecosystem. And this is a case where this is actually an Africanized honeybees, but because Africanized honeybees are active very early in the day, they actually took all of the pollen from this plant here in the background, which is a dwarf bear claw poppy. And there's a truly oligolectic bee that's dependent on the pollen from this plant species in order to reproduce. It's the only plant that it visits, or the only genus of plants that it visits, and that's Perdita maconus. And that species of pollinator, that bee, has completely disappeared from this system in Utah, likely because of pollen extraction by honeybees. So this is a case of an extirpation of a native bee, likely because of the presence of a non-native honeybee. So that's a sort of a really brief look at competition. As I mentioned, Vicki's going to take a little bit deeper dive into some of the competition studies that have come out over the last decade, even more than that as well when I'm finished here. Another major issue when it comes to native bees and honeybees, or managed bees in general, is disease. And disease is a leading cause of decline in both native bees and managed bees. If you talk to almost anybody about honeybee health, they're very concerned about the Varroa destructor, which is a mite that affects honeybee populations. Deformed wing virus is another virus that affects the growth of honeybee wings and therefore affects their foraging ability. And then a fungal pathogen called Nosema ceranae can be highly virulent to honeybee populations. And likewise, diseases have been one of the major factors in the decline of the rusty patch bumblebee and Franklin's bumblebee. A lot of indications show that Nosema bombi, which is a fungal pathogen, is one of the leading causes of decline of that species as well. So disease is something we're really thinking about in terms of the conservation of bees and long-term health. And there are many different ways that diseases can be spread by managed bees. There's sort of three mechanisms that have been described by Greystock et al. In 2016. What they called spillover, where you get a managed bee with a pathogen that then spreads that pathogen to wild bees. You can get something called facilitation, where there may be a disease, but just the presence of the managed bee causes enough stress in native bees that the transmission of disease becomes much more likely. And then we get something called spillback, and this is probably something that has caused some of the declines that we've seen in our native bees or native bumblebees, where you get a disease that's present in native bee populations. It gets accumulated and built up, and you get resistance that happens in a managed bee population. And then that managed bee population actually amplifies that disease back into wild bee populations and gets spread throughout much of the country, or can be spread rapidly, much more rapidly than would happen sort of on its own. And Sidney Cameron et al. Looked at this issue in 2016 as sort of the leading hypothesis for the decline in our native bees. And they looked at, this is, to be clear, this is looking at managed bumblebees and not managed honeybees, but it still is disease transmission. So during the period of time when managed bumblebees were first introduced to the United States, Before that, we had very low rates of Nosema bombi in our native bumblebee populations. And then during the early 90s, when managed bumblebees were introduced into a lot of these landscapes, you can see a sharp increase in Nosema bombi after that, including high incidences in a lot of the species of bumblebees that are in decline. This is the western bumblebee, this is the rusty-patched bumblebee, and this is the American bumblebee that have all seen pretty rapid declines over the last 20 years since these pathogens were introduced by managed bees into systems. And that's just one example. There are many examples of honeybees of honeybees transmitting diseases to native bees when interacting at flowers. So they can leave some of these diseases in pollen or on flowers, and then when native bees visit, they can contract these diseases. A number of virulent that have transformed from honeybees to bumblebees. So Crithidia bombi, a bunch of RNA viruses, including deformed wing virus. This has been seen in bumblebees now. Israeli acute paralysis virus has been seen in native bees. And even Nosema ceranae, which was believed to only be a honeybee-specific disease, has also been detected in bumblebees in natural populations, believed transmitted from honeybees. And, you know, to be clear, one of the Peter Greystock et al., you know, in their paper said one of the best ways to avoid the potentially devastating effects of spillover, spillback, and facilitation in wild bees is to prevent their mixing with managed bees. So making sure that our native bee populations, especially in natural areas, are protected from introduction of these diseases. So that's a brief look at disease and how it's affecting some of these issues and how what the role that honeybees have and other managed bees have in that. Now we're going to look at plant communities and some of what we've learned about how honeybees can affect plant communities and pollinator networks. So a lot of studies have looked at this over the last, oh gosh, probably 50 years or so. And what we know is there's a kind of a lot of anecdotal reports of honeybees disrupting pollinator networks, forcing resource shifts, and a lot of other things like that. But as I mentioned before, we do know that honeybees visit, in general, less than 50% of flowering plants in natural areas. So they're poor replacements of native pollinators. And at this point, at least, most of our natural areas are not pollinator deficient. There's plenty of pollinators out there to do the pollination of our native plants in our native ecosystems. They're not necessarily in need of a boost of pollinators. And we need to let those animals and those systems do their thing. There have been some examples that have shown that that honeybees can actually not only affect the pollinator network, but also reduce seed set in plant populations. This is a study that came out in 2017 that looked at areas of, this is a population with high honeybee densities. This is in an orange grove where honeybees that were introduced spilled from the orange grove over into a neighboring woodland. And then they looked at it in an adjacent woodland that didn't have high honeybee densities, that had low honeybee densities. And what you can see here is that at high honeybee densities, there's a lot less sort of crossover between pollinator and plant. So there's much less interaction within the pollinator network, whereas over here with low honeybee densities, you get a really high crossover. Lots of pollinators are visiting lots of different plants. And the outcome of that, in this case, for this particular plant that they looked at, was when fewer pollinators were visiting fewer species of plants, you actually had a reduce in seed set. So that sort of crossover and diversity of pollinators actually is good for many different plants. And when you introduce honeybees at high densities into a landscape, you can actually get reduced seed set in certain plant populations. Another example of an impact that honeybees can have in natural areas is facilitating an invasive mutualism. Honeybees preferentially sometimes forage on non-native plants, which can be highly abundant. And they were often native at the honeybee's native range. So they're well suited to be able to extract pollen and nectar from those plants. And this is particularly true in incompatible plants where honeybees can facilitate this invasive mutualism. This is a picture of a European honeybee on yellow star thistle in the western United States, and there have been a number of studies that have shown that in the presence of honeybees, that the yellow star thistle has increased seed set. And obviously in natural areas, this is not something that we're looking for. So this is again like a really brief foray into a lot of the different issues, but really, quick conclusions that we can draw from this is that we know that pollinators are in decline, but most importantly, we know that native bee declines are leading towards extinction, or at least risk of extinction. Our non-native honeybees are not at risk of extinction at this point in time. We know that honeybees compete with native bees for limited resources. We may not have all the answers as to the level of competition or how native bee populations are specifically being affected, but we also know that we need to take action. Managed bees, we also know, spread diseases to native bees, and in some cases those diseases can be highly virulent, leading to declines in native pollinator populations. And then we also know that honeybees can have effects on plant populations. Again, we don't have clear information about how this happens in every system, but we do see a lot of negative impacts out there, or at least the potential for negative impacts to happen. And so our conclusions at this point, after looking through the research, and when I say our conclusions, I'm speaking for the Xerces Society at this point, this is the conclusion that we came up with in our paper that looks at the overview of the potential impacts. We says, because of the potential threats to our native pollinators, until additional evidence exists documenting that honeybees have, at a minimum, a net neutral effect on our native biota, we urge land managers to consider these potential impacts and their relevance when making a decision about the placement of apiaries on public lands and natural areas. So we're really urging at this point the use of the precautionary principle that our natural areas should be refuges for our native bees, and really making sure that any decisions moving forward are compatible with natural lands management decisions, not just in the short term, but in the long term. One of the things to think about for land managers all over the country is, I mentioned a quarter of our bumblebees in North America are facing some degree of extinction risk. I have a map here. These are the 11 of the most highly imperiled species with their ranges overlapping each other. And you can see there's nowhere in North America that does not have a species of imperiled bumblebee. In many places, including throughout the upper Midwest and the Western United States, we have as many as 7 overlapping species in one particular area. So there are, imperiled populations, native pollinator populations pretty much anywhere you go in North America. And so basically, given all of that, what are our recommendations for land managers in natural areas at this point? I think one of the most important things that we try to tell people is that beekeeping is not wildlife conservation. Beekeeping is beekeeping. It's a great hobby. You get honey out of the deal. You can actually learn a lot from a social insect. They're beautiful animals that you can learn a lot from. But just keeping honeybees is not conservation. Creating habitat and spaces for these animals to thrive and to get the food they need and the overwintering and nesting resources, that is conservation. So that's one of the first things. But so on public lands, we really encourage natural areas managers to avoid areas with sensitive bee populations, and keeping in mind that honeybees can fly up to 3 miles. Also keep in mind that even if you don't know what your pollinator populations are, all of the research shows that diverse wildflower areas typically have diverse native bee populations, and we want to avoid competition in those areas. It's also really important with large honeybee apiaries to ensure that there's sufficient infrastructure in terms of roads and landing areas and things like that. And then we also want to think about invasive plant species management and other management goals. It's also worth considering human-bear conflicts. The presence of honeybees does often draw in bears as they look for sources of protein with bee larvae, and also just with calories with honey. And so then if considering all those things, if you do decide that, that honeybees are compatible with your management goals, apiaries should be placed more than 4 miles from known locations of pollinators that are listed on state or federal Endangered Species Act or designated as special status, sensitive, or other species of concern. And this includes plants. And then also 4 miles from wilderness and wilderness study areas and congressionally designated preserves and monuments, and also 4 miles from habitats of special value for biodiversity and or pollinators. Also, each apiary should have no more than 20 hives to keep the density of honeybees appropriate for both native bees and for honeybees. And apiaries should be separated by at least 4 miles from each other. So that is, this is a slide that shows the evidence for our recommendations. I don't really want to go into great detail because I think I'm dipping into Vicki's time here and I want to give her time to get through her. If anyone has questions about where these recommendations came from or how we developed them, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation offline. But anyway, thank you for paying attention to this and for spending your time here on a really important subject that I think is really important for our natural areas and for the native pollinators and pollination networks in those. And I think the idea here is that Vicki's going to present and then the two of us will address questions at the very end. So thanks very much. And Vicki, sorry for stealing a little bit of your time, and thanks for your patience.
Great, everyone. So welcome to the second half of the presentation. I'm really happy to see everyone here. Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you, Vicki, and we are seeing your slides as well. So
perfect. Let me just get into slideshow view and we're good. So I'd like to take the opportunity to dive a little deeper, working off of some of the great background information that Rich provided, into specifically the question of competition and interactions between managed honeybees and wild native bees. So when you have, there's this innate potential for competitive interactions between honeybees and native bees because, or rather unmanaged bees, because honeybees and wild bees both require the exact same resource, nectar and pollen, from flowers for their daily activities and their reproduction. So there's this inherent potential for competition. And there's a challenge that has emerged in terms of maintaining honeybee productivity and sustaining wild and native bees. So to understand the challenge and why there actually is an issue and why we have had to address some of these questions of honeybees in natural areas or areas of natural forage, we have to look at the magnitude of the honeybee industry. So we're looking at currently about 2.67 million colonies of honeybees in the United States. While this number is down quite a bit from a historical high, that's a lot of bees that need and want to be fed. And currently, honeybees are one of the main managed pollinators in commercial agriculture, and 80% of crops derive some form of benefit from pollinator services, be that improved yield or pollination de facto, so that they would not produce fruit without pollination. And because of lifestyle and ease of management, the honeybee has become the pollinator of general choice in terms of commercial agriculture. And there's a very significant economic impact here which certainly drives a lot of interest. The most recent records, so from 2017 reported in 2018, have pollinator services amounting to $435 million in the economy, and an additional $318 million coming from honey production, which was represented by 150 million pounds of honey. So it's not an insignificant component of the agricultural economy, the economy in general, and agroecosystems. But
I'm sorry to interrupt. We've got some complaints about some echoing. So I was wondering, you might want to turn down your volume slightly. That might help. And another thing is, if we keep getting complaints, you might want to just speak directly into the computer rather than use a headset.
Perfect. Is this any better? I'll do the next slide like this, and otherwise I'll go straight to the computer. So the management challenge also is sustaining wild and native bees. Following up on what Rich mentioned, there is a huge diversity of native bee species in the United States. More than 3,600 species. They're the key pollinators of wildland plants. They support ecosystem services. They also have these unique patterns of spatiotemporal occurrence. The status is unknown for most, although there are documented trends of decline noted, and there are species that are listed as threatened or endangered. Some native pollinators are used as managed species in agriculture. It's a small list, but it is one way that they're being used. So you have managed blue orchard bees, alfalfa leaf cutting bees, a couple bumblebee species. And just to ask if, Catherine, if the echo has improved in any way.
We were getting that it has improved slightly. So I think we could probably, we can stick with it. We can hack it. You can do it.
Right, perfect. And just focusing on the specific question I had, competition. Examining evidence of competition is a very difficult task for a variety of reasons, but primarily it's quite challenging to conduct a realistic controlled study where when it comes up under scientific scrutiny and review, everyone is pretty happy that the results are genuine and rigorous. There's also a huge diversity of native bees, which would suggest that there might be a diversity of responses, and we would need to investigate a variety of different species responses to have a great consensus. So that complicates things. And what I will note about a lot of studies is that many have extrapolated the impacts of competition from changes in foraging patterns and occurrence data. And there's some pretty clear evidence that foraging patterns do not universally correlate with the survival and productivity of bees. So what we are looking for is studies that look directly at fitness impacts of competition to see if we can get some more guidance on mechanisms there. And again, just as Rich mentioned, in terms of competition, there's quite a spectrum of interactions that could happen. And when we examine the body of literature, we also see that in terms of what's reported in bee competition at the flower specifically, there's two potential forms. Interference competition, where there would be some kind of direct prevention to accessing the resource, or a more exploitative competition. And while both examples are likely within bees, we really see a lot more exploitative competition of the various forms that Rich pointed out previously. And again, the best way to measure if competition is happening is to see if you can assess and measure a fitness effect. It's the most conclusive. And this is primarily done through measuring growth, survival, and reproductive success. And the question that we ask too is there some kind of inherent competitive advantage that honeybees have? Again, following up on some of the great background content that Rich provided, we have a managed agricultural species, which does have an advantage because it can be protected by humans, its managers, against disease from the weather. It can be moved to a location that has a more abundant resource. As a honeybee as a bee, a honeybee has a large colony, which is quite unusual when it comes to the general lifestyle of a bee. It has the capacity to have really high forager recruitment, so it can tell other honeybees where the good resources are and send many bees out there. Has a generalist feeding pattern, so many resources in the landscape become acceptable. And the colonies overlap over the seasons and years. And what this allows honeybees to do, even if they're not managed, if they're feral, for example, is to buffer one bad year that might significantly impact a native solitary bee because they have food stores. So they do potentially have this inherent competitive advantage. Then the other question that comes up is, with the diversity of bee species out there, where would we expect to see the highest likelihood of competition? It could be across the board, but generally, native bees are sorted into feeding categories and how they relate to plants. So we have bees that are specialists, oligolectic or mesolectic, meaning that they feed on a few or perhaps even one genera of flowering plants. And this is the majority of bee types, and they have a narrow niche space. They're less able to shift to feed on other plants if, for example, another species enters their niche or reduces the availability of food, depletes a resource before they get there. So potentially that's an area that would experience competition because they're less able to escape from it. Whereas there's also generalist bees, like polylectic feeders, primarily exemplified by bumblebees. And these would have the broadest overlap with honeybees. So those species, when a honeybee enters their ecosystem space, would experience the most overlap, where every resource they might attempt to forage at might also be foraged on by a honeybee. And if we wanted to be very specific, bumblebees with medium tongue lengths would be the ones that have the most direct resource overlap with honeybees. So we published a review article, my research team and I, back in 2018, that tried to focus very narrowly on scientific experimental studies that aim to test if competition was occurring and what the outcome was. And with that, just a quick synopsis of the results. When we projected that very specific criteria, we really limited the review to 19 studies that were truly experimental in their design. And not to say that good information wasn't generated about general patterns and interactions between honeybees and wild bees, but there is a large body of literature where anecdotal trends are sometimes extrapolated, or observational data is used quite a bit broadly, not in an experimental context that was designed to test competition. With this limited amount of research, if you look at it at face value, we come up with relatively equivocal results. 10 of these 19 studies indicated that there was no response in the native bee community or in honeybees, or the results were inconclusive, suggesting that there wasn't enough statistical power to be able to conclude anything, whereas 9 of those studies were able to find competition, and it was universally showing a negative outcome for wild bees. But when we focus even more narrowly, so here we're really shrinking our literature base, but we look at studies that examine the fitness in some way, some kind of reproductive measure, we come up with 7 studies, 6 of which indicate that there's a negative response in wild or native bees when they're foraging or existing in a landscape in the presence of honeybees. So what I wanted to do was take a little bit of time and go through some of those studies, show you their results in as much detail as possible, and then kind of present a brief synopsis again to see where we are, so you can better understand when we're suggesting that there is a certain best management practice or a certain impact, where exactly this suggestion is coming from. So one of the first studies, and before I get into the detail of these studies, I will mention that I am reproducing and selecting some images from papers that other authors have produced, and there may be some detail lost in my presentation of the data as I flipped it or made it appropriate for this PowerPoint presentation. So I would really encourage everyone to seek the original source if they have any specific questions. So don't take these particular images as the whole story. It's all I could show in a slide. So in terms of one study that aimed to test competition and couldn't find a conclusive result for competition occurring, we have Forup and Mehmet in 2005. They looked at the interactions of bumblebees and honeybees in a landscape, and the first piece of work they did for the study was to determine if there was in fact overlap in the plants that these two species foraged on, and there was. So there was a significant dietary overlap. But then when they tried to see if there was any further relationship between an adjustment in the abundance or richness of bumblebees foraging on these shared resources in the presence of honeybees, they didn't detect a clear declining trend. There was a slight trend that showed a decrease in bumblebee abundance with honeybee abundance, but the richness wasn't impacted at all. And they suggested that there was likely a much more complex trend, something else going on, an additional variable that was necessary to describe this. So their conclusion was that they didn't, in fact, drill down to find competition. One study that was actually a very controlled cage study that did find an example of competition and potential resource avoidance due to honeybee presence was conducted by Rogers et al. In 2013. And what this particular study did is tested the foraging of bumblebees on artificial floral resources when they were presented with a scenario where the floral resource was either brand new and had not previously been visited by any forager. The resource had previously been visited by a honeybee or by another bumblebee. And what was found in this study was specifically on bombus impatiens, was that if a honeybee had previously visited the artificial floral resource, the bumblebee was significantly less likely to visit that resource. There was a slight decrease in visitation when another bumblebee had first visited, but nowhere near what was seen when a honeybee was there first. So this was an example showing that there is absolutely a precedent here for competition to occur with honeybees creating an avoidance of resources in native bumblebees. Now, moving into some landscape level studies, Lindstrom et al. In 2016 conducted a study in a very resource-rich, mass-flowering, although monocrop, agricultural landscape of canola. This study was conducted in Europe, where canola is referred to as rapeseed. And they, in this landscape, had a control site where just native bees, so solitary bees and bumblebees, were foraging, as well as other agricultural fields that had significantly large numbers of honeybees added into those systems. And what they found in their studies was that as the density of honeybees increased, the density of bumblebees and solitary bees decreased. But there was also another effect that they found. And as the size of the agricultural field increased, this response got even stronger, suggesting that being further away from heterogeneous landscapes, so field edges where there might be more diverse wildflowers, really significantly increases the impact that honeybees have on the forager occurrence of other native bees. Switching back now to a study conducted in North America, more specifically on bumblebees, Diane Thompson has a really great set of consistent or parallel studies that actually helped outline this concept that seeking information just from forager visits to flowers or the patterns we see on flowers does not necessarily give you the full correct answer of what's happening. So she did a two-part study. And in this part was published after the second study, so you'll see that the dates seem inconsistent. But in 2006, she published the results of the no competition found portion of her study, where she looked at the foraging of Bombus occidentalis in a landscape where honeybees were added into the landscape in some areas and not others. And over multiple seasons and field observations, there was only one set of observations in 1 month that showed a significant decreasing trend of more honeybees equals less bumblebees. Otherwise, the trend was kind of scattered and all over the place. So her conclusion here was that there was no consistent evidence. However, when she revisited this particular experiment and looked at the reproductive output of bumblebee colonies in this study, she found that the number of male and female reproductives that the bumblebee colonies produced were lower, as well as the physical size of the virgin queens and drones were physically smaller when these bumblebee colonies were in the presence of honeybees. So this result was masked, so to speak, by foraging results, which indicated that there's really nothing going on, nothing to see here. But when we see that we start looking at fitness, that's when we start getting more reliable data, and it's much more consistent. Following along on this particular trend, you'll see going through some of the next few slides, was a study by Dave Golson in 2009, looking at, again, worker size. So the size of bumblebees when those bumblebees are existing in a landscape that is considered with or without honeybees. And in this particular case, it was naturalized areas within an agricultural landscape, and honeybee presence was landscapes where honeybees were actually situated for additional crop pollination, and honeybee absence were landscapes where there were no additional managed bees. There could have potentially been background feral honeybees. This study was conducted in Scotland, where honeybees are considered native, but they persist in much larger numbers because of human management. This study found that all 4 species of bumblebees that were tested showed a consistent trend of having significantly smaller workers when they were in landscapes where honeybees were present. And worker size in bumblebees is often, or worker queen drone size is correlated to nutritional availability, and it can be a surrogate for how much pollen and nectar the colonies were able to bring in during critical growth and reproduction phases. One more study that was looking at fitness impacts, both size of queens as well as the overall weight of colonies, which can measure both the amount of brood and honey or nectar that's produced, was conducted in 2014 by Abulgami et al. And they also found fitness impacts, an indicator of competition, in bumblebee colonies that were placed near honeybee apiaries. So they had a set of honeybee colonies that were in isolation or not near any apiaries, and those that were close to apiaries, and they did find significant trends in weight gain, as well as smaller queens produced when these bumblebee colonies were closer to honeybees. I have a few more to share with you now, focusing on non-bumblebees. So if you remember back to some of the information I presented, there's this idea that, you know, with the diversity of the bee community and the various lifestyles, you could potentially have specialists or generalists that are more impacted by honeybee presence, or perhaps they both are. So here are a few studies going forward looking at the more specialized non-social bees that and their interactions with honeybees. So another 2-part study here by Hundowitz and Klein in 2013, they conducted a study looking at honeybee presence and the reproductive success measured by the number of nests provisioned in native bees in the presence or absence of honeybees. What they did find in their study was that there was a significant difference in foraging with or without honeybee presence. So when honeybees were present, the native bee foraging numbers were significantly reduced, but they didn't see the same trend parallel in the number of nests that the native bees make. There was a slightly lower number in landscapes with honeybees, but it wasn't statistically significant. They followed up the study with one where they had a little bit of a better handle on controlling some of the variables and an easier ability to actually measure if nests were successfully provisioned and how many nests were provisioned. This time in 2015, focusing on Osmia bicornis, the red mason bee. And they had a caged experiment, which allowed them a lot more control. And what they did was have various treatments, no honeybees, and 2 different magnitudes of honeybees, so 100 individual honeybee foragers and 300 foragers. And they looked at both the visitation and foraging on flowers that Osmia bicornis displayed, as well as how many nests the Osmia provisioned. And they did see a decline in forager visits to flowers from the red mason bee as the number of honeybees in their experiment increased. So you get more honeybees, you get far less individual visits to the flowers. They noted that the niche breadth of the red mason bee decreased, so it started visiting fewer types of flowers within the controlled experiment, as well as the most significant results were seen that there was quite a stark difference in the number of nests and individual cells that each female was able to provision when honeybees were added to the system, and the magnitude or the amount of honeybees foraging in the landscape further reduced the number of nest provisions. So again, here's an example of competition with a fitness impact that was measured. And the final study I wanted to present is just one more different species of native bee. It's a Hylaeus species, a yellow-faced bee. Quite an earlier study done in Australia in an agricultural landscape. So not a natural area, an agricultural landscape where honeybees are persistent and present, and they're always there. In this particular scenario, there was an addition of honeybee apiaries and monitoring tube nest provisioning by this particular yellow-faced bee over a season. And this is a species that's multi-voltine, so it'll produce multiple generations throughout the year. And overall, throughout the season, there were parts of the year where the native solitary bee seemed unaffected by having honeybees in its landscapes, but then again, also parts of the year where there were significantly reduced nest provisioning. And in fact, there was a 23% reduction overall in how many nests these bees made when they were in a landscape with honeybees. So again, fitness being examined and a very clear, direct answer resulting. So as a summary of the findings, I just wanted to drive home the point that the results from foraging data very much appear equivocal. A lot of the larger review papers that have looked at this sort of pattern have found that you know, it's inconsistent. We really can't say if there is or is not an impact of competition, but a much more consistent trend starts to emerge when the fitness of bees is assessed, so native bees versus honeybees. It's pretty difficult, though, to assess fitness correctly. There have only been, to date, 7 studies that have really tried to look at reproduction or growth. So we're really narrowing the amount of literature that can help guide us in this case. Both generalists and specialists can be impacted and have been shown to be impacted by honeybees. So we should be looking cautionarily on the entire bee community and not just ones that might have perhaps the most direct niche overlap. What was quite interesting in these findings, though, and I would encourage you to dive a bit deeper into some of the studies, is that landscape context could significantly alter or buffer the impacts of competition. So more complex landscapes that provide more foraging opportunities seem to ameliorate to some extent the negative impacts that honeybee foraging had on native bees. But what should be pointed out too, which is I think, quite useful in terms of discussions with land managers is that with these studies, neither the nativity or the status as managed seem to matter in terms of the competitive interaction likelihood or the action that was seen. Wild or feral honeybees in their native range, experiments set up to test the impact of background wild bees, wild honeybees on wild native bees, wild solitary bees, I should say, showed the same pattern. So it is a life history characteristic of honeybees, something that's made them quite successful, that can have an impact on solitary bees that don't have the same forager recruitment or colonial lifestyle. And lastly, I do want to point out that there are significant gaps in our understanding and quite a lot of further questions that would be great to open up the discussion for. One that comes up is, can we calculate a curing capacity, often followed by, well, is this the right question to ask? And there have been quite a few. Rich mentioned them, and here's another example. Jim Kane and Vince Tempedito in 2016 doing the hive unit monthly foraging equivalent, where one honeybee hive in a month forages on the equivalent resource of 33,000 megakyle rotundata. So there's one of the 3,600 species that we have an equivalency for how honeybees might relate to their impact on a landscape, but that's one of very many. Another question or another gap that we find is examining the reproductive output of a much wider range of native species or wild species. Less than 20 have been examined in these studies, and again, the bee diversity is quite high. We could expect some consistent trends, but again, we have such diverse life histories that it's sometimes hard to rely on one species to speak for the other 3,600, or in a global context, almost 20,000. And one thing that is currently lacking, again, is that studies have not looked at fitness and population level trends through time. The longest duration that was examined was 1 year, where the direct impacts to fitness were examined. And while a reduction in reproductive output or smaller, physically smaller bees being produced is certainly not desirable, it's not clear if that has a lasting impact on the survival through time. Perhaps there's a threshold. Maybe we've already reached it, maybe we've surpassed it. So it's quite a big unknown, which again really points towards being very cautious and using the precautionary principle, because we don't quite know what the magnitude of these impacts is. So I'll leave it at that. That's a bit of a dense, heavy science punch for a Wednesday, and happy to answer questions live now, and of course, if any remain offline, my contact information is there. I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Catherine.
Thanks, you guys. That was great. I want to step in here really briefly and just sort of help moderate, because we've had a ton of questions, which is great to see. Just a general thing, a lot of people have asked in the chat boxes about where they can find additional information. And I thought that I would sort of push that back to you guys, Rich and Vicki, because I think both of the organizations you work for have rich availability of resources, at least that exist. That would be correct, right? Okay. So I direct people to the Xerces.org website and Vicki's Pollinator Partnership organization to get some of that information that it looks like people are really hungry for.
Yeah, actually, maybe a better URL for us. It's I can put it in the chat box here, but bringbackthepollinators.org goes to our resource center that has a lot of these valuable resources there. So I'll type that in the chat box right now.
Great. I was going to go back and sort of I think some of the questions have fallen into different categories. I think one of the categories that people are sort of interested in is, what can we do? What do you do? What are some of the best practices and the immediate steps that both natural areas managers can use? And we also obviously clearly have quite a few people who are interested in smaller things, gardens and urban gardening and things like that. And I was wondering if there was some resources for best management practices for these people that you can direct them to.
Sure, I can start. I think you get to the point of what can I do depends on who you are and who you work for and where you work, I think is a really important first piece. But, at Xerces at this point, we really feel like if conservation is your concern, and it's a major part of the land that you manage, whether that be your backyard or, a 1,000,000-acre natural area, the creating habitat's really the best thing that we can do. As Vicki mentioned in her talk, native bees and honeybees need the same thing. They need pollen, and they need nectar, and they need a pesticide-free environment, and they need a place to build their nest. And there are a ton of resources available out there with local plant lists and local nurseries that sell native plants. But really the best thing that we can be doing, whether it's on the scale of a porch, 2 stories up, or, a backyard or a large natural area, is to start putting, some of these high quality, bee attractive plants back on the landscape and making sure that there are safe places for native bees to build their nests. We didn't get into the ecology of native bees that much, but most native bees actually nest directly in the ground, so just leaving bare soil and not mulching everything. I've seen some questions in the chat about sort of tunnel or trap nesting bees as well, and making sure that there's pithy stems in your plants, in your plantings, to allow some of our native bees that nest in those places to find a place to build a nest. So that's really the best thing that we're encouraging everybody to do. And if habitat gets out on the landscape in large quantities, it's not only going to support native bees, that will also support the honeybees that are out there and give them the clean forage and food that they need, particularly if that forage is pesticide free. And, I think one of the major things as well is we really need to get the agricultural community on board here. They're dependent on honeybees for their pollination services right now. And so, agricultural areas need to find ways for clean forage for honeybees. And I think we need to find really good solutions of putting fallow fields to use in that way, so that we can help support honeybees and the honeybee industry as well.
That's great.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Well, no, just following up on what Rich said, it's a very broad question, but one of the issues that brought up this webinar and the speaker series that we had previously was the desire of a lot of beekeepers to seek good, clean pasture for their bees on lands that are otherwise natural. And basically, the best advice that we can give is to improve and maintain agricultural or other working lands to satisfy some of these nutritional needs, which are quite extreme when you see the number of colonies that are out there for honeybees, and keep natural areas for native bees. It makes a lot more sense, because this competition is either potential or evident in many cases. And I am just noticing a quick question in the chat about the impact that honeybees might have on a much smaller scale. If you perhaps are an urban beekeeper and you have a small hive, like 1 or 2 hives, and there is the rest of the natural wild bee community in an urban or suburban landscape. And the question there is probably, again, the data doesn't really give us a lot of information to go on in that particular context. We probably are, again, looking at, if you know that you live in an area with a sensitive landscape, a species that's listed, we should focus more on habitat conservation for native bees, and even urban beekeeping, again, great hobby, but could be minimized just to make sure that we're not adding more potential threat to species that are already facing challenges. But there's, I think on that question, there's the least information out of this whole spectrum that we're working with.
But I think it's important to also just point out to people that, you know, I don't think the message is not to have a backyard honeybee hive. I think the message from my perspective is it depends on what your interests are. If you're interested in learning from social insects and getting honey, then I think being a backyard beekeeper is a great hobby. It's like having a pet. But if your interest is bee conservation and functional landscapes, like I think probably we can say not having honeybees is a better solution and focusing on habitat creation that will support the native bees that are already there, as well as potentially your neighbor's honeybees. So I would say, look at it from that perspective. If your goal is only conservation, you know, I don't think that having honeybees is a solution. It's not conservation. But if your goal is to have honey and to learn from social insects, honeybees are a beautiful way to do that.
I wanted to put in something. I've noticed several people have asked about specific, oh gosh, I'm going to lose the word here. What chemicals basically affect native bees more than honeybees? And if there are differences, are there some that affect native bees or ground nesting bees more than other bees? Pesticides. Thank you. The P word.
What? Pesticides? In terms of how different pesticides affect different bees? Is that the question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there have been actually more than one question about pesticides and their impact. So.
Yeah, I mean, pesticides is a really broad word, right? So there's many different classes of pesticides. There's insecticides and herbicides and fungicides and rodenticides, and you know, this could be its own webinar for sure. I think generally that our view at Xerces is in ornamental landscapes that particularly toxic insecticides have absolutely no role there. We need these habitats to be functional, and you know, allowing insects in that role I think is very important in terms of having beneficial insects there that are doing, you know, some of the biocontrol that you need. Makes it such that, you know, toxic insecticides have no place in ornamental landscapes. Working landscapes, I think, is a different conversation. You know, when it comes to herbicide use, we're a little bit more liberal in our suggestions. I think, especially for land managers, that herbicides can be really important tools in land managers' toolboxes, and they just need to be used effectively in a really targeted way. But you know, in many cases, those herbicides are being used to replace a non-native species, you know, for a restoration. And in the long run, you know, putting good, high-quality habitat on the ground is valuable. And if herbicides are a tool that land managers need to put that habitat in the ground now, as opposed to waiting 5 years, that's probably a reasonable trade-off to make in some cases. Obviously, I don't want to make blanket recommendations, but that's, I think, where we stand. But generally, reducing the use of pesticides across the landscape is going to create more functional and better habitats for native bees and honeybees.
Yeah, hopefully that answers Donna Edwards' question about the EPA recently rolling back regulations on neonics.
Sure, and I also wonder if maybe part of the question in general would be about honeybees being colonial and social bees, and solitary bees being one individual provisioning a whole nest. And while insecticides that target bees can be toxic to both honeybees and wild bees, native bees in a similar context, often some of the impacts in a colonial species can be buffered because there's physically more individuals in a hive. So there may very well be products that don't appear as toxic at the colony reproductive level, but at the individual solitary bee reproductive level can have further repercussions. We're in a bit of a tough point there because most products are tested on the reproduction of a honeybee colony, bumblebees in some cases as well, and not on individual solitary bees. So there can be a difference in perceived toxicity of a product, but again, it's case by case.
I think another important, thanks for saying that, Vicki. I think that's an important piece to look at. We don't know that much about toxicity, a lot of these products. But I think particularly for natural areas, some of which you're probably using fungicides and herbicides more than you are insecticides, I think, in a lot of these areas. And one of the things that's coming up more and more is the interaction of these products with each other. So particularly as fungicides interact with a lot of these highly toxic insecticides, they can create even more toxic sort of mixes for bees. So really pay attention to not just the product that you're using at that moment, but how it might interact with other products being used sort of in the landscape that they're working on. I think this is an emerging field of toxicity for bees, and something that really needs to be more closely paid attention to.
Awesome. There's obviously a lot more specific questions. My goal here has been to try to get people directed towards resources that they need rather than having their specific question answered directly, because there's so many. I think there's been several questions about agriculture and the relationship between native bees and places that are being used very heavily for agriculture. What do you, and several people have sort of suggested, do we need new laws? Is it legislation that we need to look at? Do we need to look at different farming practices? Does either of you want to weigh in on that kind of larger discussion? That is a big one.
No, it's a really big one. My first response is always to the question of, shifting from a honeybee-based model to a more wild bee pollination model. Is that possible? And I tend to be an optimistic person, so I'm going to say yes, but it requires a lot of adjustments to an agricultural industry that honeybees fit really well into, and has become, kind of a feedback system of how large farms are, what time of year things are planted, what we can grow, because of the ability to move bees where we need them, rather than relying on natural pollinator services that are seasonally appropriate. So it's a challenge. I think, some systems could be much easily transferred, but some other systems like, for example, the magnitude of almond pollination in California, the way it looks like right now, that would be a very significant shift with a lot of players. But nothing's beyond happening if we're interested in doing it.
Yeah, I would agree that things are headed in the right direction. We're actually working with some of the largest almond farmers in Southern California to help them put clean forage on the ground underneath trees for native bees. And I think there's tremendous opportunities there for long-term pollinator health and pollinator sustainability. And there are plenty of resources out there and studies out there, including some of the seminal work by Claire Kremen in the early 2000s, late 1990s, showing that, with enough habitat, native bees can provide 100% of pollination services for many systems out there. But it is going to take a paradigm shift. We do need the habitat near those farms to provide that services. And I think we need to realize and recognize that, and I don't want to put down farmers. They're some of the most intelligent and hardworking people that I've ever interacted with. But I think recognizing that a paradigm shift means putting habitat on the ground, and that doesn't just mean a wildflower strip next to a field that's sprayed with insecticides. That isn't going to work. We need longer term, high quality habitat solutions to begin building this network now. We need our native bees as an insurance policy for pollination services, which can ultimately reduce inputs from farmers. And really I think the other important thing to think about is we can't just talk about pollinators, right? There are a whole system of other invertebrates that can create biocontrol systems that reduce needs for insecticides and other things as well. So we need to think conservation biocontrol and integrated pest management and all of these things at larger scales than we're currently implementing them. And you know, we've been working with farmers over the last 25 years, and some of them have made really great strides and improvements in these areas. And I think hopefully the needle keeps moving in the right direction.
Awesome. I'm going to move towards wrapping this up, everybody. I wanted to remind everyone who was on that we do have the message boards. This conversation can continue if you're a member with NAA, and Vicki will use her watchful eye to answer questions and sort of get things going there. And if you're not a member, think about joining. And that's pretty much it. The video archive will be posted very soon. I try to get it up as soon as possible, so you guys should all have the link very soon. If you know anybody missed it, you can forward it to them. And any last words, Rich and Vicki, before we sign off?
I just want to thank the Natural Areas Association for hosting this webinar. I think it was really great and a great conversation and great place to get started. And thanks in advance to you, Vicki, for handling all the questions.
Yeah. But I would say let's just keep the conversation going, because you've seen from both of our presentations that we're at the beginning of a potentially very large amount of information that will come in and really help us manage natural resources much more wisely and scientifically, which is what we're trying to do. And I look forward to it. So yeah, bring on the questions and we'll do our best. It would be really, just looking forward to it.
Sounds great. I want to thank you both personally for prizing these amazing talks and giving people more access to them. We obviously had people at the conference hear these talks, but we're really glad to be able to deliver this so that a greater group of natural areas professionals can, and just people interested in it can hear and benefit from what you've got to say. So thanks everybody. We'll be announcing another webinar soon. Until then, thanks and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye,
take care.
everybody.